All right. I'm your host, Donny Budinsky, and you're in for a fascinating journey tonight. Here at Standing for Truth, we're passionate about upholding the truth of biblical creation. And tonight's program is a shining example of why that mission matters. It's an absolute honor to be joined by the one and only Dr. DeYoung, a brilliant mind and a true defender of creation truth. Together, we'll be diving into the world of biomimicry, where human engineers are taking cues from God's flawless designs in nature. From birds inspiring flight to geckos influencing adhesives, the fingerprints of the Creator are everywhere. And tonight, we're going to uncover how science is catching up with Scripture. You won't want to miss a moment of this exciting discussion. Dr. Don DeYoung, how are you doing tonight?
Well, hello, Donny. Good to meet you and our listeners.
Absolutely. I'm excited for this, Don. I've been familiar with you for a while. I have your book, Thousands, Not Billions, and I'm very familiar with your talks and interviews. But, Don, for anybody who might be unfamiliar with who you are, what I'd like to do before we get into your talk tonight on a very fascinating topic, biomimicry, I do want to give you a formal introduction. And so Dr. Don DeYoung is a fellow and past president, from my understanding, of the Creation Research Society, with over 1,700 members worldwide. The CRS funds research, operates a lab in Arizona, and publishes books and a technical quarterly journal. He gives lectures on many creation topics, including astronomy, intelligent design, the Genesis flood, and dinosaurs. Don strongly believes that the details of nature are a powerful testimony to the Creator's care for us. Don has conducted workshops for children with hands-on Bible science activities. He has also written and spoken for the organization Answers in Genesis. And Don, if I'm not mistaken, you've written over 21 books?
That is correct, Donny.
Okay. Well, very good, Don. Again, it's great to have you here. And to the live audience, we are going to be having a format that comprises a presentation from Don. Then after Don's presentation, we're going to jump into a discussion and live Q&A. I'll have some of my own questions based on what Don presents on. And if you have a question or a challenge, perhaps you're skeptical of what we're saying here tonight on creation and young earth creation, feel free to send in questions and challenges, and we will engage those after the presentation. So with that, Don, if you're ready, brother, I can pull up your screen and we can get right into your presentation.
Well, thank you, Donny, and so appreciate letting me share and see where this thing goes. My background actually is physics and math. I've had a whole career as a faculty member at a small college in Indiana. I do enjoy writing and speaking on this whole topic of biblical creation. Well, what's happened in recent years is an interesting phenomena in the science world. What we've noticed is that all around us are practical ideas and discoveries to be made in nature, solves problems, gives us new products, and just all for our well-being. In fact, this is where engineers and inventors are looking these days. They're looking at nature for solutions to problems and for new ideas. And so this whole area has come to be called biomimicry. Bio, the biology world. A lot of these examples are in living things, and in mimicking or copying them for good. What this does is it gives a whole new way to think about science, discovering the secrets that were placed there for our discovery and application. Well, what we'll do for a little while is give some of the examples. They're fascinating as time goes on. So there are different categories, and let's start on the small scale. Is there intelligent design in the...
Don, I don't want to interrupt you, but are you sharing any visuals or slides, or were you waiting to do that? Because currently we just see your face, and I wanted to make sure that. Are you on your PowerPoint by any
Yes.
chance right now?
You have slides, and I was ready to show those, so I'm going to jump into that.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to make sure that you didn't want the audience to see them now. So
Yes.
take your time. Okay.
Yep. Thank you for that. So there's that word biomimicry, which is a real catchword. Now, the typical idea is that these different examples have evolved over millions of years. As we'll find out, they've been here from the beginning. They haven't changed. God set the whole thing up in the first place. So anyway, we're going to look at several different examples. And the first one that we have is in the micro world. By the way, here's our whole list that I can run through. Design on all levels of nature. So our first example here is something sounds kind of odd. It's called slime mold. It doesn't amount to much. This is part animal, part plant, lives on decaying wood. Some of our audience will have seen this in the woods. And what can we learn from something like this? Well, it's been noticed that this material is always on the search for food. And what it does is it sends out tendrils in different directions looking for nutrition. It's complicated because the slime mold, if it doesn't reach anything with one direction, it pulls back and goes in another direction. And so this whole idea was explored by scientists in recent years. And what was done is an interesting experiment. They took a map of Japan and marked on it over on a large platform the different cities in Japan, and there they put little bits of food. And then they put some slime mold, one piece of it on this board, and turned out the lights to see what would happen. And this is a chart to show what happened over the next 24 hours. The slime mold, which is the little yellow part, reached out in different directions trying to find food and made connections between these different areas. Anyway, at the end, when they turned the lights back on, they realized that the system that this slime mold had set up was very similar to the rail system in Japan, connecting different cities, minimizing the time to go between these cities. Now, there's a whole math story to this. It's called the salesman problem, how you would make a route and minimize the time between different places. And the slime mold seemed to have understood and captured that. Anyway, mathematically, an algorithm was set up copying how the slime mold spread out. And this mathematic algorithm turns out to be useful to the planning for information grids, even setting up highway systems. Slime mold doesn't even have a brain, and yet mathematically it's able to find the least path, the least time between different places. Of all things, slime mold is teaching us. It's our instructor. It's showing us how to minimize distances in rail systems, communications, fiber optics. So this is a micro level example of what we're learning from nature for something that we thought was simple. Now, I'm going to leave the micro world and move over to the insect world. In the summertime, we have lightning bugs, fireflies. Always interesting to see them flying around. Here's just a picture of some turning their lights off and on. Now, how do these critters make their own light? They don't have batteries. They don't have light bulbs, but instead what they do is they make two different chemicals in their body. One chemical is called luciferin. The other one is called luciferase. And when they mix these two chemicals together, the lights come on. Well, in the laboratory, we've been able to duplicate these chemicals, and we've come up with this whole idea of a light stick. Now, these are very popular today. The kids like them running around outside. They're in parades. In fact, we even use them in fishing, light sticks, and they've replaced flares for cars. And they make these things by the millions or billions, and they come up with light sticks in different colors now. Where did we come up with these ideas? By studying fireflies. They had it at the beginning. Now, by the way, our light sticks only last a few hours. whereas fireflies can flash their lights for several weeks. And there's a lot of mystery there. We're not sure how they communicate, how often they blink their lights in tandem with each other. But anyway, this idea of light sticks comes from studying lightning bugs who made it in the first place. Examples from nature that come up with practical ideas for us, useful and just fun ideas like a glow stick. Now, from the micro world and insects, let's turn to flight. You know, there's something interesting about feathers. So here we just have a colorful picture of a bird. Now, if you take a feather, even a duck feather or a bird feather, and just hold it up and pull on the sides, you can kind of pull it apart. You can mess up a feather. But then when you stroke it carefully, you can kind of reconstruct it and put it back together. Feathers, the sides will come apart and come back together. And if you look at this very closely, what a feather has are little flexible hooks, hundreds of them. Well, this reminds us of something that's very useful in nature, actually found back in the 1950s, Velcro. It was a man in England who found cockleburrs sticking to the fur of his dog when he walked in the woods. He got back home and looked at it closely, and here were these little flexible hooks. They're in prickers, they're in seeds, and they're in feathers. Of course, Velcro now is everywhere, and it's a very useful material. And there's just a picture of someone holding a piece there. That Englishman, he did not invent Velcro. He discovered it already existing in nature. So Velcro is a classic example of biomimicry, very useful to us, found on all sides. While we're talking about flight, here's another interesting example of design in nature. Now, this involves a bird that we have worldwide called a kingfisher. It's a very odd-looking bird. It has a long, narrow beak. Now, what this bird does is it'll sit up on a branch, and when it sees a minnow in the water, it dives straight down into the water to capture some food. And it hardly makes any splash at all. Now, what can we learn from a kingfisher? Well, this story connects with Japan once again, where they have bullet trains. These are high-speed trains that in the US, we're just starting to get into this. Now, in Japan, these trains can travel fast, 200 miles an hour. And there are also a lot of tunnels. It was found that when a bullet train leaves a tunnel, a cushion of air builds up. And when it exits the tunnel, it makes a large sound, a sonic boom like thunder. It rattles windows, it wakes up people, and it was not a good thing. Well, one of the designers of these trains also was a bird watcher. And he knew that the kingfisher likewise could go from air into water with very little splash because of its streamlined design. The engineers went to work and redesigned these bullet trains to mimic the style, the shape of the kingfisher, with a long, narrow front, and even the windows of this train kind of mimic the nostrils of the kingfisher. And this is the way they design trains now, the fast, high-speed trains. And it's found out when they exit a tunnel, there's no sound. It's very streamlined. And they also save about 15% on their energy. So this bird, made way back there on day number 5 of the Creation Week, is helping us to design high-speed trains. What we're doing here are running through some examples of biomimicry. Most of them have not been found, I'm sure. There are countless ideas in nature, but they're all fascinating and worth thinking about. Now, again, it's often said that these kind of designs form naturally as things evolved and got fitted over the years. Here's an example that counters that. Here's a fossil flying reptile. I'll just call it Sharo for short, thought to have lived hundreds of millions of years ago. All we have are a few fossils of this creature. But what's been found is that the way it's designed even helps us with our modern military airplanes. It's especially interesting that this creature has little wings on the front as well as larger wings on the back. It's a flying reptile. Anyway, it's been copied, especially in France, where one of their fighter planes is this kind of a delta wing plane, and copying Charo. And you can even notice the little wings way out in the front, which are mimicking this creature. So this shows that things don't change over time. This creature, which is now gone, but was around since the creation week, was designed in a way that can even help us with our high-speed flight in our own day. Well, that's air flight and the whole idea of, flying technology. Now let's go into the water, where there are many, many examples of biomimicry, intelligent design. So first of all, for our inspection, we have a lobster. Now they're in shallow water, they can see, and as we study the optics of the lobster, it just puts us in our place. It's amazing. They don't have a regular lens like we do as people. Instead, they have multiple cylinders where their eye is. They're like narrow cylinders, and the inside is covered with a mirror-like surface so that the light will ricochet through their eyes, and then it hits a sensor so they can see. Well, there's something about the way that this creature is designed. The way that that cylinder works also turns out to be a good way to focus and capture and observe X-rays. Not that the lobster can see X-rays, but his eye was designed for that kind of thing. Now, here's a close-up of the lobster eye, and it's showing actually they're kind of a square cylinder, and the way that light will ricochet through it. It's always been a problem in the physics world to capture X-rays and focus them and then detect them. The lobster shows us how. What's now done, some telescopes that are in the business of looking at X-rays from space use that same design that the lobster has. In fact, it's called an X-ray lobster telescope. And this has opened up the whole area of X-rays given off by outer galaxies and stars that we can see. Without understanding the lobster eye, we would never have come up with this. Hey, there's something else in the water that's kind of fascinating. Now, here's a quick picture, and maybe our listeners can try to identify what this is. This creature can be small or several feet long, and it's in marine water, in salt water. Of course, what we're looking at here is a cuttlefish. Now, this creature is a master of design. It can change its color almost instantly. It has different pigments in its skin, and electronically it can change its color. When it's over seaweed, it can turn green. When it's over other kinds of coral, it can turn different colors. We're learning about this and how this might work. And this is helping us, especially in the military world, to come up with new kinds of equipment and uniforms that can change their color to protect servicemen and women. They're continuing to work on this kind of thing. A lot of it is classified, but they can make things almost invisible by changing color with a background, the very thing that a cuttlefish has always done. So those are examples of design in the water. A lobster, a cuttlefish, and whole books could be written on further designs. But we're moving along here. Let me now think about land. And here's an interesting example that starts with a dog. So a century ago, there was a fella on the Atlantic Ocean coast who liked to go sailing. Now, a century ago, that's the early days, and sailing was good. But when you're in water like this, the deck of the boat can get slippery. You have to be careful. You can fall. And they just kind of lived with that. One day in the off season, this sailor was out walking his dog down a slippery sidewalk. He was slipping and sliding, but he noticed that his dog was very sure-footed and just padded right along. When they got back to the shoreline, this fella looked at the paw of his dog, and maybe some of our listeners have seen that before. It's divided into different sections, and there's kind of almost like a fingerprint on the paw, and there's little ridges. So what this fella did is he took a piece of rubber membrane and carved some scratches in it, attached that to the bottom of his shoe, and went outside, and he did not slip. This was the very first time that we came up with the idea that a tread on the bottom of a shoe could prevent a person from falling. So he went further with this and came up with a shoe. In fact, he started a whole company. And in fact, this company is still going today. His name, by the way, was Sperry. And this is a popular sailing shoe. When he came up with this idea, he sold it to the US Navy, and now it's worldwide. If you look at your shoe, especially an athletic shoe, if it has ridges on the bottom, that idea was first thought of by studying the paw of a puppy dog, which of course has always had that wonderful design. Land animals, showing us different ways to come up with useful products and examples. Now, how about in the people world? We've talked about sea creatures. We talked about animals on land. This is a fellow by the name of Robert Kearns, and this goes back to the 1960s. This fellow one day was driving down the road. It was a rainy day, and the windshield wiper, it just had a typical one speed. Again, this is several decades ago. It wasn't raining hard enough for the windshield wiper to work, but it was enough that once in a while you had to turn it on and off. And he thought, isn't that interesting? That it's kind of awkward. It doesn't really fit the amount of water that's coming down. And he thought, now when I consider my eye, the way that I blink and the way that my eyelid works, it blinks when needed and keeps a clear view. Can I come up with a windshield wiper that's modeled like the human eye? So he liked to tinker with things, mechanical, and he worked with his windshield wiper and came up with the idea of the intermittent variety that can, just run the windshield every 5 seconds or 10 seconds. And today that's in all of our cars, but that was just not done back then. He took his idea to the car manufacturers and they bought into it. And of course, now that's made all over the world. The idea of this variable windshield wipers, it was the idea that was inspired by looking at the way the human eye works and more biomimicry. So this time from the animal world, we've gone to the people world. There are many examples of this idea in the human body. Let me mention another one. Now, here's an older picture, kind of classic, of a femur. That's the largest bone in the human body, kind of between our knee and our thigh. And it's an interesting bone. It has that ball and socket on the top and kind of tilted over, and so it can swivel. Well, here's the story. 100 years ago, this fella who was an architect, he was visiting his doctor friend, and there they were sitting at the desk, and one of these bones was on the desk from the past as a study tool. And the architect picked up this bone and he thought, isn't that interesting, the way the upper part arches over, it has a curve to it by the ball and socket. And he took this bone and inverted it, turned it 180 degrees so that the ball and socket was on the bottom. And he thought, can I maybe build something like this that makes use of this arch structure? Now, by the way, this fellow's name, the architect, his name is Gustav. His name is Gustav Eiffel. And 100 years ago, there was a World's Fair that was being planned in Paris. And there was a competition of putting up a building like they do today for World's Fairs. And he thought, maybe I can use the design of this femur in my structure. Now, you already recognize the name Eiffel. He went to work and came up with this idea of the Eiffel Tower. Here's a close-up picture of the inside of the bone. Of course, the Eiffel Tower has a lot of steel gridwork in it, and all of the little struts and crisscrosses even model the inside structure of the human bone. So anyway, this was done, and he entered this in the contest and got the contract to build the Eiffel Tower. Now, when he did this, the other architects laughed at this, and they said, come on, this is a crazy looking building. It'll probably fall down under its own weight. Well, here we are a century later. All the other buildings are long past, but the Eiffel Tower still stands, the most visited structure in Europe. And this arch on the bottom, the way it curves over, designed the same way that the human femur is. So now all of a sudden, biomimicry is helping us in the whole design area of architecture. You know, one thing that we've left out in this brief survey of design in nature would be the plant world. So just a couple of examples there. All around North America, we have beech trees. This is a fascinating tree. In the spring, the whole leaf forms and it's all folded up in a pod. This picture kind of shows the crisscross, the way it folds up. It actually kind of telescopes on itself, almost like an accordion compact. Well, this was studied again by engineers and inventors thinking, how can we make use of this folding mechanism? The idea that this whole leaf folds up and then unfolds quickly. Well, you know, today in our space program, we need to send things up into orbit, and then we have to open them up, especially solar panels to collect solar energy. And so this idea, the way the beech leaf forms, is used in some satellites. Here's one from Japan from decades ago. And even the inset shows the crisscross structure where they folded this panel all up, sprung it into space, and then opened it up just like the beech tree opens up. So now the leaves of trees and the way leaves are folded are helping us in the space program. Now, closer to Earth, here I live in the upper Midwest in Indiana, and we have a lot of snow and ice on the roads, and it can get slippery. We have found a way to address that problem, and not with abrasive salts and chloride chemicals that can do damage to a road. It's been found that sugar beets, they manufacture a liquid which will not freeze. And it's just put in a holding pond when they're making sugar out of sugar beets. But now they are taking this material, this liquid from this vegetable, and they can spray it on roads and it does not freeze. And so that the ice and the snow are cleared. And this is biodegradable and it just washes away in the spring. So this is a way for safety to keep cars and trucks safe using this material, this leftover material from the operation of getting sugar. Thanks to sugar beets serving a purpose for that. Hey, here's another idea even closer to home. In Indiana, our whole state is full of corn. We have great fields of it. We have great growing material, and all through North America. It's been found that when a shoot of corn grows on a sunny day, sunlight goes right down through the stem of the corn and it goes underground. This picture on the left shows a root system of a young corn shoot. And if you could dig the soil out of the way, it's lit up underground. This is how corn grows. It is conducting sunlight underground along with the nutrients that are down there to make the corn grow. Well, the way you can conduct light through a corn shoot is still used today when it comes to this thing called fiber optics. Now, fiber optics, it almost looks like fishing line. It can be a clear material, and it is being spread all over our major cities. It's replacing electrical wires. You can send email through fiber optics and also some kinds of energy. And so fiber optics is being manufactured and it's being improved. And one thing that's being learned about how to make fiber optics better is to study corn. It's been around since the plants were made way back there on day number 3, and it's teaching us this high-tech area of fiber optics. The experiments go on in this whole area of biomimicry. Let me just mention one last one, which is really fascinating because this leaves the biomimicry area It's the non-living area. So this is something that does not evolve. It does not mutate. This design has been around since the creation week, and it involves pulsars. This is a type of a star that winks at us. It blinks off and on. Actually, it's spinning very rapidly, and it'll have a bright spot or a place where radiation is being emitted. So every time it turns, we get a flash from it, whether it's visible or not. Some of these pulsars turn very rapidly, 100 times per second, 600 times per second, and they're an amazing type of star. It's a good thing that our sun doesn't do this, blinking off and on, but pulsars do. What we have found is that their mechanism is so exact, right down to the nanosecond. And what's become of these is they've become a time standard. They are competing with atomic clocks as a way to carefully keep track of time. This is much needed in our days of GPS. And so here we have pulsar stars. You know, you think way back to the creation week where it says stars are made for signs and for seasons. And it's a way to keep track of time on the nanoscale. And that's how stars are helping us out. Hey, we've run through quite a menu here of design examples. The micro world, slime mold. The insect world, lightning bugs. And of course, all the other insects are telling us about micro robots and all that area. In the area of flight, we had Sharo, that ancient flying reptile. And we have the birds that can jump into water and all the other ones. In the water side, we had lobsters and many other creatures. On land, we had the dog that showed us all about the kind of soles to put on our shoes. Many more examples on land animals, on design examples. For people, we had windshield wipers, we had the femur for building design, and there's vegetation, and there's non-life. Again, it's often said that these things evolve over time. Sharo kind of counters that idea. The idea that things do mutate and natural select. Pulsar stars have been around since the beginning. So this whole area is just a great example of intelligent design. It's a whole new way to think about science. Said it before. Discovering the secrets that were placed in nature for us. You know, even in a world that's far from perfect today, and there are plenty of problems, we can still see how this whole system has been put together for our survival and for our well-being. So the search goes on, and books are being written on this area of biomimicry, and it's kind of a fun topic. And by the way, a colleague and I put together a book called Discovery of Design, and we have 100 different examples of it, and we're finding more each day. It's a great way to look at creation, to look at nature, the way God has set that up for us. So anyway, that's our quick look at biomimicry. Donny, back to you.
Dr. Don DeYoung, what a fascinating topic, brother. I appreciate the visuals and I appreciate all the study and work you put into that. Very interesting topic that really does point to the creator. A couple notes that I took, and I'd like to ask you this question because you the study on this issue continues, and you just mentioned that you have a book where you go over 100 examples of biomimicry. And so I'm wondering, based on one example you gave, which is fascinating, that fiber optics, this high-tech area is based on corn. Does that mean the more technology advances, the more technology becomes more sophisticated, I guess we could say? Does that mean we'll find more examples? Because it seems like we're catching up as time goes on to what God has already thought of and designed in the biological world.
I think that's exactly what that means, Donnie. I think our whole world and our whole physical creation is just preloaded with these ideas waiting for us to come up with and find. And, you know, especially when you get into the small scale, the micro world and the nano world, we've not begun to explore what kind of design, what kind of ideas are there waiting for us. I think on the fun side, Donnie, even when you come up with something like the Pulsar stars, I think maybe the angels are watching us. And when we come up with the idea that those kind of stars are a time standard, they say, well, people have finally uncovered that idea and have finally come up with it. And what will be the next one? There may well be an infinite number of these ideas, and you have to have the kind of mind to find them. And that's what inventors and engineers come up with. But they're out there waiting for us.
It's incredible. Don, I like to say it's a great time to be a biblical creationist. And as time goes on, the evidence becomes that much more abundant. And this might not apply directly to biomimicry, or perhaps it does, but I'm noticing in light of what we're discovering in the biological world, Don, regarding these adaptive mechanisms that have been front-loaded or preloaded, I like that word you used, into the world of biology. We also see that in man-made inventions now. Like in vehicles, we have all these front-loaded systems, safety mechanisms, for example, that seem to mimic what we see in the in the world of biology, where you've got automatic emergency braking, or you have these built-in backup cameras where if you're getting too close to another car, it'll beep, or lane change, where if you're going in the wrong lane, it's built in where the car will automatically straighten you out. And so is this in a way very similar to how God has programmed his creatures with the ability to adapt and change, Don?
Well, that's certainly true. And, nature is not simple. You're into engineering designs and intricacies that we are still uncovering. And, Donnie, there's a whole nother a level to look at this, and that would be mathematics.
Right.
We are still discovering, new branches and whole different strings of math functions and areas to study. Over and over again, math kind of leads the way. We'll come up with a new function, a new area of math, and then after we get that figured out, we look at nature and find out that math was already there, that it's already in different systems. So math is the language of creation, very complex, much of it still beyond us, but that as well is part of the design. It's part of the intelligent design that just covers everything.
Amen. Well, how I've seen, and you've probably seen the same thing, how I've seen skeptics or naturalistic evolutionists address this evidence from biomimicry, Don, is they will interpret biomimicry as basically being a product of evolutionary processes like selection, mutations, and nature is basically the source of solutions in the biological world without necessarily invoking a creator. So they're basically saying, no, we don't need a creator to explain these designs. Evolution over time can account for them. And I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that is often assumed that mutations and natural selection will solve the problem. But as even the other side is finding out, that does not work. There's another example that we could go on with called the trilobite, which is a fascinating fossil. It no longer exists on the earth, but it had its day. And that was a little critter that lived under shallow seawater. We find their fossils by the billion. This thing is said to have lived very early in the stage of life. And it lived in shallow water because in the fossils, we can see its eyes. In fact, this is the first fossil that we find that has eyes. Well, still today, you can take a fossil trilobite and you can dissect its eye because it's made out of a hard mineral called calcite. As we do that, as we poke into this fossil, we see multiple lenses, we see fiber optics, we see very advanced optics, even beyond what our human eyes are today. And again, this is the first creature we have with any eyes at all. It shows that these things don't slowly evolve and improve over time. From the very start, we've had advancements, we've had design beyond imagination as we discover it day by day.
That's a great response, Don. And I've seen many times, we host a lot of debates here, and we'll present evidence for design like you've done here. And the more informed critics, they will say, and I think in a way you did kind of answer this with the complexity of the trilobite, but they will challenge us as a creationist. They'll say, well, okay, how can we tell the difference between design and that which is not the result of design? And what they mean by that is, even as creationists, right, Don, we believe in adaptation. We believe in variation. Let's say from the ark, you have a wolf-like archetype. And then from there, you get different variations or species, including all your domestic dogs. Well, would we say that a Chihuahua or a Great Dane is designed, or is that largely the result of artificial selection? And so their challenge to us is, okay, show me something that is design versus something that is not necessarily the result of design. What would be a good way to answer that challenge, Don?
Yes, the debate does go on.
It does.
We are certainly surrounded by design. Now, you got to be careful here. Evolution, to me, is a master counterfeit. And if you want to go down that road, it's very intellectually satisfying. Large books are written on that, very brilliant people. But of course, it's wrong. It's a counterfeit, but it is very inviting to kind of suck people in. I think pride is involved there of understanding everything ourselves. So design is on all sides, and you can go different directions with it. But again, when you look at the fossil record right back to the beginning of life, the creation week, you don't find simple things that slowly become more complex. Things are very complex from the very start, as we're saying, even complex beyond what we have seen yet and what we can imagine. And the fact is, Scripture tells us that if a person misses this design, there's really no excuse. I mean, maybe you can fool yourself in your mind, but it's there on all sides. It's design.
That's right. The Bible says that his creation, the things of his creation are clearly seen. We are without excuse. And I like you pointing back to the earlier stages, I guess you could say, of the so-called geologic column, where you have highly complex creatures like trilobites just suddenly popping up, right? The Cambrian explosion, where you have this sudden appearance of all these major phyla, jellyfish, coral, and these are phylum level differences, Don, with no real precursors. And so as a creationist, this is something that we might expect to find if design is true. Is that right, Don?
You're certainly correct with that. And again, Donnie, there's always a deeper level to this. And of course, the origin of life is said to be an unsolved mystery. And the closer you look at this, the origin of anything is a mystery to the secular world. The moon, they come up one theory after another, but it doesn't work. There's our nearest neighbor, no good explanation of how the moon got there. And even in my whole world, my area of physics, the laws that run the whole thing, the law of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, all the way through school, I learned about all these laws, but it was never mentioned where these laws came from. Who set up the law of gravity? And how is it maintained? Because laws don't run by themselves. Someone is keeping those things working. And so the origin is a very basic question as well, with a good creation foundation.
That's a great response. Some good points. We're all familiar with Richard Dawkins, kind of a famous atheist, Don. And I think it's in his book, The Blind Watchmaker. Now, his thoughts on this, and we kind of addressed this earlier, but because he's such a big name out there and has been for a while, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this. But he basically looks to what it sounds like to me, apparent design. So he's saying, sure, life looks designed. He's admitted that. But this appearance of design is all an illusion and can be explained by natural selection. If we were confronted with an argument like that from Richard Dawkins, or even just a quote directly from his book, The Blind Watchmaker, by a skeptic, someone who's on the fence, what would be the best way to interact with that?
Yes, I'm familiar with Richard Dawkins. Yeah. What do you say? Again, you can talk yourself into that it's all apparent design and not the real thing. I guess what I would say is maybe on the surface, you can imagine even how a crystal could form on its own or a snowflake.
Right.
But go to a deeper level where there's design and then there's sub design and sub down it goes. So you're only looking at the surface. There's design beyond what we can even imagine on lower and lower levels. And so it's very simplistic to say, yeah, this thing just happened, because there's a whole foundation beneath it of things that don't just happen, no matter how many eons of time that you have.
Well, what if a critic were to push back on that and say, well, as humans, we've designed a variety of domestic dogs, over 400, I think, through artificial selection. We know in the wild, we get speciation and variation simply due to selection, maybe mutations. We probably, as a creationist, look to design diversity. But the point is, from the mind of the evolutionist, they're seeing in real time new variations come about. As humans, we're artificially selecting for a lot of these traits. And so if we could do that through nature, natural means, then why can't nature in the long run create a lot of these complex systems?
Yeah, that's a good thought. And I mean, a lot of design, new products are coming along, but whether you're talking about an automobile or you're talking about an airplane or a drone or whatever it is, where are you getting that design from? What are you copying? You're copying the animal and the plant world in the first place.
Right.
So it's kind of a derivative thing that you're working on.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point, especially the planes. I mean, or even submarines, how they mimic whales and aquatic creatures, and sonar systems with bats and dolphins, from my understanding, birds, the ability to fly in the first place. And so what comes to mind now, Don, is arguments for common descent, which go against design, based on homology and nested hierarchies. Maybe let's start with homology. I've seen you speak on this. And so these shared structures in the biological world, the evolutionists will say, well, that's the result of descent with modification. But is that the only explanation, or is there a design explanation in there instead, Don?
Yeah, good point, Donny. Of course, homology is similarities between, let's say, the limbs of a person and the fins of a fish or of an animal, where there's a similarity in the bones. And so it's often said, see, that shows that we all had a common designer at the start, a common originator. But let me start over with that. What that's showing is that we have a common creator who's using some of the same principles in the animal world and in the people world. After all, that's the kind of design that works on this earth, with the gravity that we have, with the kind of movement that we got to take. It's certainly the creator's option to use a design that works in the animal world and in the people world. So a common ancestor or a common creator, it almost becomes kind of a draw there. But I think, well, life is full of choices, and that's one of them.
Well, I think you make a really important point there that I think people need to understand, that there's a lot of pieces of evidence that are a draw, or they're agnostic to the overall debate on creation evolution. I think homology is one of them. As a creationist, we would look to homology and we would say, okay, human engineers design in homologous patterns. Why shouldn't God? And then the evolutionist will say, well, these shared structures in the biological world is due to common ancestry or common descent. And so in a way, it's not discriminating between the models. So we should probably, to advance the debate in a meaningful manner, look to pieces of evidence that can actually help differentiate between the models. Maybe a piece of evidence where only creation can account for and evolution can't. And would you say that an argument like biomimicry would fall into that category, where creation has the better response rather than it being a draw between the models, Don?
Well, I think it does. At least it's a very satisfying view. And again, it's a whole different way to look at nature, discovering the secrets that God put there, and the designs are all around us. Let me say just a bit more about that whole idea of the common ancestor. Again,
Sure.
assuming that mutation and natural selection can pull this off. You know, you might have had on your program another time a mention of a classic experiment that's been done where they took a bacteria and they've watched it go through generations. It's the kind of thing that can divide. And as this thing has gone through its different generations, they've zapped it with chemicals and radiation and different temperatures to try to get this bacteria to change, to mutate, to evolve, to become improved. This kind of experiment with particular kinds of bacteria, they're done at universities, has gone through hundreds and hundreds of generations. What do we end up with after all of this? And these experiments are still going on. It's still bacteria. In fact, they're worse off than they were in the first place because they picked up genetic defects. These kind of experiments show that common ancestor won't work. Yet mutations and natural selection, it's a loss of information. It runs things downhill. It's a dead end.
That is an excellent point, Don. And typically you're more informed evolutionists. They'll say, and they'll even admit to largely what you're saying, population genetics. They'll say, yeah, the majority of mutations are deleterious. As we would say, Don, they're nearly neutral, slightly deleterious, not big enough for selection to see or do anything about. And so they build up and they degenerate and things are moving downhill rather than uphill. But they'll say this, and there's been papers written on the topic from evolutionary biologists. They'll say, okay, even in light of the fact that the majority of mutations are deleterious and low impact, the few truly beneficial mutations that come about can counterbalance all of that damage and therefore drive forward evolution. They call it adaptive evolution. And they'll point out a number of examples of so-called beneficial mutations that I'm sure you're familiar with, Don. And so I guess my question to you would be then, what are your thoughts on that argument that, hey, these few beneficials over here, these can counterbalance all that damage and drive evolutionary change?
Well, I've heard those arguments as well, but you know, just draw the picture of this. If one out of many somehow survives, and then you need a population there, and then one of those might survive, and you lose the rest of the population. Again, you're going to be going downhill. That's just not the kind of thing that has any growth to it. You're going to end up with less and less as time goes on. It's an argument, but it doesn't hold anything.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. It would be like if we're trying to climb up a mountain, Dr. DeYoung, and we take 2 steps up, but after every 1,000 steps down, maybe we keep falling back 1,000. And then ever so often we go up 1 or 2. Are we ever going to climb to the top of that? Isn't that mountain probable? Chances are we're never going to climb up to the top of that mountain, right?
Exactly.
So, okay. And what I've found looking into their best examples of beneficial mutations, and I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of them actually turn out when you look at them on a deeper level, as you've been saying, I like that. We find that they're reductive. They're functionally compromising to organisms. They're due to broken down systems. I mean, sickle cell anemia, for example, gives a decent advantage to those with sickle cell anemia. They're resistant to malaria, from my understanding. But at a deeper level, what's that the result of, Don? Broken cell, it's a deformed hemoglobin molecule. So are those the kinds of mutations that are going to counterbalance any damage? I mean, they're still reductive when you look deep enough.
Yes. And you know what the opposition says in the final chapter? It doesn't matter how improbable it is, it happened, so deal with it. And that's kind of the position they have. Donnie, in a whole different world, a different area, it's the search for life in space. You know, they keep going to Mars and other places searching for life. The thought is if life evolved on planet Earth, it surely evolved elsewhere. And so a question in the astronomy world is, where is everybody? And they're looking and looking, and there's nothing there. It's another dead end, but it does go on, thinking it's got to be there someplace. And it looks more and more like we are unique in this universe.
Amen. Yeah, and unfortunately, many have been sucked into believing in aliens and even ancient alien theories. And I think they get a lot of these ideas from the movies in Hollywood, which are interesting and fun, but they're science fiction, not science reality. And so I'd like to ask you this next question, Don, because I really appreciate the answers you're giving here. And I think you'll have a helpful answer to this. So there's a video that's been going around for a while from Richard Dawkins, again, famous atheist, and it's got 1 million+ views. And he's basically asked the question, Don, what's a single fact? And then I'm just summarizing here, so I might not get it exact, but what's a single fact that refutes creation? And what he points to is the order of the biological world, what many might call the nested hierarchical patterns we see. He says, well, the fact that, humans share more with a chimpanzee than we do with, let's say, a dog or a fish, that there's these natural nested hierarchical patterns. And an evolutionist might ask it this way, Don. Okay, if creation's true, if life was designed in separate ancestries rather than universal ancestry, then why did God design the world in a way where humans are most similar to, let's say, chimpanzees than other creatures like dogs or whales? What would be a good response to that?
Well, that's almost that whole area of homology again, similarities on a lower level. And once again, as said before, it's certainly the creator's prerogative to use similarities in certain ways, certain things. It's really a mosaic, parts here and there. Yeah, it's an argument, but certainly on their side, it's not a strong one. And, the debate goes on even of how similar we really are to the ape world, talking about junk DNA and these other areas. You've had some of that on your program where we have a lot to learn, and there are more differences than we first thought that there were. So there's certainly overlap. I mean, that's what life is like, but it's certainly not a done deal. You're not going to falsify creation.
Right. To me, Don, it's another draw, largely. It's another agnostic piece of evidence. Okay, so the evolutionist says what? They say, well, we're most similar to chimpanzees in overall morphology, anatomy, because they'll say, okay, there's some portions, maybe we're more dissimilar. But when you look at everything, morphology, anatomy, physiology, and genetics, we're most similar to a chimp, more similar to a chimp than a dog. Well, they would say, well, that's because we share a more recent common ancestor with the chimpanzee than we do with the dog. But we as creationists, we'd say, well, is it really a big surprise, Don, that we share more with, let's say, a chimpanzee than we do with a dog or a fish? If you just stand back, we do look a lot more similar to a chimp than we do to a dog or a fish. I mean, if I were to take my kids to the zoo and tell them to run around and point out what we look most similar to, are they going to pick a fish? Or they'll probably pick an ape. They'll probably pick some kind of chimpanzee or even a monkey. And so, isn't it just overall kind of agnostic to the debate again? It's a draw on that issue.
Well, it is. You remind me, Donnie, of something that happened in a zoo. This is the London Zoo a few years ago, when they put some people in a cage, just to kind of show that we are just animals.
Right.
And I thought the best response I heard, this little girl went to the zoo and she was walking through, and she came to that enclosure and said, "What are people doing in there?" In other words, this young girl knew the difference between people and the whole animal world, whereas most of the adults in that zoo were trying to merge.
Right. Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I've wondered, and this is just kind of a thought experiment. We understand there's homology that you've mentioned. We also know that there's genetic level homology, similar sequences between, let's say, us and a chimp. But if evolution's true and they're looking to mutational load, mutations build up in a neutral manner, and they build up over hundreds of thousands to millions of years. And then they say, well, those mutations can act as a hidden reservoir, basically, for selection to act upon and drive evolutionary change combined with beneficial mutations. But if that's true, wouldn't those mutations scramble a lot of these signatures of homology? I feel like homology makes more sense of a common designer. But if evolution's true, why do we have such a strong signal in terms of these similarities? You think those mutations over time would scramble a lot of those signatures? Don, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, surely. In fact, the fossil record would be filled with mistakes, with mutations, if there was any truth to that. But it doesn't happen. There's a whole world now of living fossils, these creatures we find that we thought were long gone, and now we find them again. Things like the ginkgo tree and such, they haven't changed at all. And from the very start, we've had these designs. So there's not a whole track record of this whole lineage of errors and mutations leading up to what we have today. It's been well designed from the very start.
Amen. What you've been saying brings this to mind as well in biomimicry. I think it kind of relates. And I'd like to get your thoughts on this, because the Bible says that we as humans were created in the image of God. And so that tells me and I know there's a lot of debate on what that means, but that at least tells us that there's something about us that reflects the divine. And therefore, perhaps we can get a sense for how God designed the biological world based on we as humans design things. And so evolutionists like to look to homology. They like to look to nested hierarchies. But wait a minute. Human engineers are designing in homologous patterns. They're designing in nested hierarchical patterns. If you think about it, a sedan shares more with a hatchback than it does with, let's say, a boat or an airplane. So you have nested hierarchies in the design world. And so in a way, then, is that a reflection as to how God designed? We're made in his image, and we're designing in similar ways that we see in the biological world. Is that in a way mimicry as well?
Well, yes, I think it is. Of course, being in the image of God, I think, that involves our whole spiritual nature.
Right.
Ecclesiastes 3 says that we have in our hearts the idea of eternity, of a life after this one. Some similarities with the animal world, but when it comes to the spirit world, we're on a whole different level. Of course, we're responsible to care for the animals, but there's a lot of variety there.
So you mentioned it earlier, junk DNA. I've seen popular evolutionists on YouTube, couple 100,000 subs. They'll give it to creationists. They'll say, okay, fine, homology in functional sequences makes sense. We need those similar sequences or genes to function in similar ways, let's say between humans and chimps. But then their follow-up is this. And I think there's a built-in assumption, and I think you're going to point it out, Don. But they'll say, okay, but why would God use homology in junk sequences, in non-functional sequences? That's their assertion. They'll say we shouldn't have homology in non-functional sequences. There's no reason to have those signatures there if there's no functional requirements for that. I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on that, Don.
Well, I think what that's revealing, Donny, is our lack of knowledge. To say something has no function, just wait, just give that more time. We are unpeeling layers and seeing things that we did not notice before. So certainly it's a fallen world, and we've lost ground, and genetic problems do show up. But to say something is functionless, or that it's some sort of something from our ancestral past, that certainly needs to be challenged. There are a lot of assumptions going into that.
That's right. And a lot of the evolutionists are not up to date either, because where we might say, well, just wait until we get research, wait as time goes on, we'll find functions. But a lot of what they point to, like endogenous retroviruses or pseudogenes or other junk areas in the genome, we actually do have evidence now in the conventional literature that, hey, these are functioning in the immune system or acting to determine cell types, embryological development, so on and so forth. So a lot of evolutionists that are even using that argument, Don, they don't seem to be as up to date as they need to be in the conventional literature, because we are finding a lot of functions for this so-called junk DNA.
You know, at one time there was a long list of vestigial organs in
Right.
a human body, over 100 of them. And one by one, they are being crossed off as we realize that at some stage of life, these things do have a function. And so the whole physician world, they're a little more careful now about removing parts of the human body because they're not sure about how all that interaction occurs.
What about what they call atavisms? If I remember correctly, that would be like something popping up from our ancestral history. You know, some babies maybe are born with a tail, or I think they've even pointed to a piece. Some people are born, or maybe we all have some kind of part to our ear that is similar to what dogs have. Atavisms they'll use as evidence for evolution. Don, I'm curious as to your thoughts on that.
Well, once again, to bring up something like that and say that shows my view that that's part of our animal ancestry, I just that does just not carry a lot of weight with me. There's a lot we don't know about all those little items as you express them. Again, I would say, wait and see. Now, certainly things change, Donnie. Let's say the wisdom teeth that we have. They don't serve a lot of purpose anymore. Wisdom teeth can cause problems. You might have to get them removed. But especially a century ago when diets were different, wisdom teeth played more of a part, maybe from creation right up until relatively recent times. But diets can change that. So there are some changes involved, but that's certainly not biological evolution.
What would you say is the function of something like goosebumps? Evolutionists like to look to goosebumps. There's no function for that. That's just an example of, I think, when we were hairy pre-human apes, that our hand would stand, possibly, as an adaptive response to something.
Well, goosebumps. Now, I'm a physicist. I'm not a biology, so I don't know all that goes into that. But for someone to say that they serve no purpose, I would say that's a rather awkward statement for them to say. We just don't know. There's a lot about us that we don't know yet.
Yeah, and off the cuff, goosebumps probably has something to do with body regulation. I when I get goosebumps, sometimes it's cold or it's a reaction to something. I could see that. I could see goosebumps being there to help regulate us in some way. But I did want to address this real quick, Don. We have skeptics in the chat, and I appreciate our skeptics and critics. And so, Rosina, thanks for the question. She says, who said ERVs were junk DNA? And I see this frequently. And the evolutionists themselves have said this. So here's from a paper in 2021, Virology. Switching sides, how endogenous retroviruses protect us from viral infection. Isn't that fascinating, Don? If you Google, what's the best evidence for evolution these days? Endogenous retroviruses. That's what comes up consistently. And even that's been overturned. Anyways, right in this paper on the screen, it says long disregarded as junk DNA or genomic dark matter. Endogenous retroviruses have turned out to represent important components of the antiviral immune response. So point is, they admit that ERVs have long been understood to be junk DNA. And so the answer to that question, right from the secular literature.
Well, yes. And by the way, Donnie, I challenge my students and might challenge our listeners as well to Google an example of a macroscopic change. I mean, something that actually can be witnessed or seen. There's a lot of micro changes that goes on all the time, but a macro change in the laboratory or somehow, they're not there. There's the great assumption of the large scale changes.
Right. Well, one of the famous experiments that you might be familiar with is Lenski's E. coli experiment. Thousands and thousands of generations of these E. coli. And one might say, well, they're still E. coli, but I mean, at the end of the day, they're looking for, adaptive beneficial mutations. But the last time I checked in on that experiment, even with some of the adaptive responses that they've had, these bacteria have shrunken functional genome size. They're handicapped. They're lazy. They're worse off in the end, Don. So, I mean, even with a couple beneficial mutations, it doesn't seem to be counterbalancing anything. That's for sure.
Yes, that kind of experiment is fatal to natural selection, mutation, pulling everything off.
Would it be akin to this? If I, Don, temporarily, I wanted better gas mileage in my car. So I decided to start tearing things out. Okay, let's tear out the interior seats, maybe throw off the rear view mirrors, the mirror in the front, remove weight from the car. Okay, so temporarily I can get better gas mileage. I've removed weight. But overall, am I making the car better? No, I'm making it worse. I'm basically ruining the car just for that one small benefit. And I see that akin to what we see in these evolutionary experiments. We've seen some true beneficial mutations, let's say in Lenski's experiment, Don, but at the end of the day, these bacteria are worse off. They're degenerating. They're throwing out pre-existing genes to adapt temporarily. It's not going to drive evolutionary change. So my next question, Don, you've written a book, Thousands, Not Billions. I have it here. Excellent book. We've seen several people in the chat now bring it up and mention it. And I was wondering if you could firstly summarize for anybody interested, anybody who might be unfamiliar with the material in that book. We have it here for anybody who wants to purchase it. Thousands, Not Billions. Can you summarize the material, but also the importance of it in relation to the origins debate?
Well, sure. That Thousands, Not Billions book came out of a research project from the last couple of decades that a number of us undertook. We kept hearing about the whole idea of deep time, and people wanted answers for this. What about carbon-14 dating? What does the Bible really say? And so we did just a thorough look at this. We pulled ourselves together, we're all in science from different fields, just to kind of hash the whole thing through. Along the way, we collected samples worldwide. We took data on radioisotope dating. We also brought in a couple of theologians who could closely look at the book of Genesis to see what it says. And so it was a whole project to go after the age of the earth. And, that whole debate goes on, but I think we made a strong case that a recent supernatural creation is very satisfying and makes good sense, whether you're looking at the rocks or whether you're looking at meteorites or wherever you happen to be looking. We had different chapters in that book on again, what the Bible says, and maybe one quick example when it comes to carbon-14 dating. That's an interesting area. Now, that's not the million of year things that it's used with rocks, but it is used usually for hundreds of thousands of years. What we found out is that carbon-14 is not a friend of deep time. Instead, it supports a recent supernatural creation. That's what some of our findings as we looked at samples. In fact, we didn't carry out these experiments ourselves because we favor creation, and what we would say from our own laboratories would be rather suspicious. And so we chartered laboratories to do some of our experiments for us. As an example, we found carbon-14 atoms where they don't belong. Carbon-14 is a temporary isotope. It's not supposed to last all that long, at least for tens of thousands of years. But we found and are continuing to find carbon-14 in rocks, minerals, fossils, dinosaur bones, every place we look, even in diamonds. What this is showing us, one part of that RATE project, is that these things may not be as old as everyone says. That name RATE stands for radioisotopes and the age of the earth. So we just made a whole thorough inspection of what's going on, and we kind of knocked the ball into the court of deep time of geology to say, what do you think about this? Not that we are going to convince the whole geology world that they are off in the whole time scale, but we give them a challenge. We've given them something to think about. And this is what people wanted. They wanted an alternate because, when you read the scripture carefully, if you take it literally, we have thousands of years, but not millions or billions. And that's what this book comes up with, the data backing that up.
Amazing. Don, amazing. I've seen you in an interview mention the reaction of a lot of these lab technicians. And I wonder if you could expand on this, where you would bring these samples, I think it was coal you spoke of, to test them for C14. And they basically said, well, that's a waste of money because we wouldn't expect to find radiocarbon. Don, I'd be curious if you could speak to that.
Yes, we didn't try to hide what we were doing, but we obtained coal samples, by the way, from the government, and we made an appointment at one of these high-tech labs where they carefully measure carbon-14, and we said, "Sir, we're talking to the technician. We'd like you to analyze these samples of coal for carbon-14," and the technician said, "Are you crazy? Don't you realize that coal is from the Carboniferous period? It's 200 million years old. It cannot have any carbon-14 in it." We said, "Well, we'll pay you. This is a research project." And so they took on this there and several other laboratories. And in each and every case, we have found carbon-14 existing in these samples. Of course, the reply right away is, well, maybe it's contaminated, but they're very careful about that. And especially when it comes to diamonds, where we also found carbon-14, diamonds cannot be contaminated. It's the hardest mineral there is. And so these technicians are interested in what we've done because no one had thought about analyzing those kind of experiments before. Creation research opens up whole new areas to explore that the secular world would never have thought of.
Right. Those are some great points. A clip-worthy moment, as we say. We like to make smaller videos of our content here, and it's such an important issue. And so you briefly mentioned it there, contamination. So is it your position, Don, that the C14, the presence of C14 that we find in all this coal, which correlates, from my understanding, with the flood about 4,500 years ago, that it can't be from modern organic matter, nor can it be from handling during lab preparation? Either contamination is ruled out, Don?
Well, you can go back and forth on that and possible explanations, but these laboratories, they're very careful about contamination, and they would be offended if you say that's what you've done. You've contaminated things. So I don't think that's a good response. There are other ideas that maybe carbon-14 is being made inside these samples due to some kind of nuclear interaction, but the numbers just aren't there. That doesn't work either. Again, I would call back to diamond, which cannot be contaminated. And we looked actually the interior of these diamonds and found carbon-14. Not by the way that diamonds are from the flood. I think they're from the original creation.
Right. So does that mean, and correct me if I'm wrong in asking this question improperly, does that mean that the radiocarbon that you find in the diamonds, that's intrinsic to the diamond, as in it was created, that those diamonds are created basically?
Well, they are. I mean, from the creation week, everything very complex. And you have carbon-14, which has a half-life of just over 5,000 years. And the fact that we find some in diamonds, it's not cooked away yet. There's not a lot of it, but there is some. And it just should not be there. Any old object should be carbon-14 dead. It should no longer exist, but it's there. And even, Donnie, in dinosaur bones, we are finding carbon-14. So this research is continuing.
Wow. Even in dinosaur, and I've seen you speak to, when you open up the dinosaur bones, you're finding the soft tissue and the original organic material as well that has not decayed away. On diamonds, I've heard many skeptics say this, and I'm curious if this is accurate. So to summarize, they'll say diamonds are not made from atmospheric carbon, but are formed deep within the earth. They naturally contain some nitrogen that can be altered by the decay of radioactive elements in the diamond into C14. So basically that's why we find a little bit of C14 because of that process.
Yes, I know that argument. And there are interactions. You can make carbon-14. My goodness, you can make gold these days, but it's on the nano level. And argument that you're saying, the numbers just aren't there. You're not making a credible amount of carbon-14 that we are measuring. So I think that idea of this artificial manufacture of carbon-14 inside samples is it's really grasping at straws, and the math does not back it up.
Wow. That's amazing. We had a seminar here with Dr. John Baumgartner for almost 4 hours on catastrophic plate tectonics. We had a whole section on C14, and he made this important observation. He said at this point, the C14 in coal, the C14 in diamonds, there's still a few things to be worked out there, but to reject the implications of that, it's more so on a philosophical basis rather than a scientific one. Because as you said, these rescue devices or explanations, they're grasping at straws, aren't they?
Well, they are. They're kind of countering, the findings that our research project came up with. And, it's going to keep going back and forth. Arguments pro and con. Again, what we've done is we've kind of knocked the ball into their court, that court of deep time, and asking them just what's going on here. And so those studies continue. Let me say, Donny, I don't think that from physics, from geology, from science, we can really tell how old the Earth is. There's a whole spectrum of experiments can be done. You can get young ages, you can get old ages, and ages in between. And you kind of pick the one that you want. So how do we come up with a young Earth view? You go back to Scripture, where you have genealogy spelled out. When you add them up, if you're taking those numbers literally from father to son, the Old Testament patriarchs, once again, you end up with some thousands of years in Old Testament history, but there's no room for untold billions of years.
That's a great point. Very important point. Are you convinced then and you have a section on it here in your book, again, excellent book, the helium and zircon crystals, basically looking at the helium diffusion or leakage rates. Dr. Russell Humphrey's paper on the topic, I assume where he expands on it, gives us an age of between 6,000 and 10,000 years. Is that something you find interesting, that we get so close to what the Bible lays out in terms of the genealogies that you're talking about?
Well, that is certainly interesting, and it did make a chapter of the book, and it was a major study that Russ Humphreys carried out. But the bottom line is it's one more bit of data that the helium is still there. It hasn't diffused out of the sample, so they don't look that old, and diffusion experiments just kind of back that up. But as I said previously, it's another bit of data, this one backing up a young Earth. It might counter some other data that shows an old Earth. And once again, you have a whole spectrum of data, and you kind of choose the one you want. But some of that data is certainly on our side. It cannot be said that an ancient Earth has been proved dogmatically, because this data goes the other direction.
Is it a straw man argument, Dr. DeYoung, when the critics say regarding the helium and zircon crystals? Is it a straw man to say, well, the only reason that they got the numbers that they did, that at least support or contribute to some of the evidence for the young Earth creation model, they'll say, well, they assumed all constant temperatures the whole time. But if you assume lower temperatures in the past and not just a uniformitarian, well, it's funny how they like to throw out uniformitarianism when it doesn't work for them. But anyways, that's kind of their assertion, that the rate researchers or Dr. Russell Humphreys assumed constant temperatures. Is that accurate, Don?
I would say it's not a straw man argument, but perhaps not the strongest argument. Now, I want to be careful, because Russ Humphreys has spent a lot of time on that and had to make a chapter of the book. But, you're talking about samples that have been brought up from deep underground with drilling rigs. Yeah. There's a lot we don't know what happened down there with temperature and pressures and fluids. And so it's data that supports us, but more data needs to be taken. You can always say that. And there are more variables perhaps that we don't know about. So far it's on our side, but again, it's not the final thing that brings things over to our side, that the debate on the age of the Earth will continue.
Right. Right. Well, and it comes to, it's a hard issue, not necessarily an evidence issue. Our starting point is the Bible and what the Bible teaches, of course. And so I'm really curious, your the rate conclusions, because what I'm gathering from what you're saying here, Don, C14 is a creationist, a good friend, maybe even best friend. But when it comes to the other dating methods like potassium to argon, uranium to lead, these longer age dating methods, the conclusion being accelerated nuclear decay. Are you convinced by that conclusion, or do you think that there might be a better explanation out there for why we get older ages for deeper rocks in the geologic column, Don?
Well, over the years, I've tried to look at all the data, Donnie, and keep an open mind on this kind of thing, but more and more convinced of the recent creation position. I see all the data, and I know how it's used to point to a deep time to long ages, but there's always another side, whether it's something that's happened to those samples or their contamination or whatever. So there's two sides to every issue. And this whole area of deep time, there's some great assumptions there that people have made, that that's got to be the way it is, but that's not necessarily the way it is after all. So I try not to be dogmatic in that book, but just kind of open the window that there's always another possibility. Things may not be as old as they say. You don't have to start to wonder about, is Genesis really telling us the truth or not? It can be, and the data supports that.
Well, that's one of many things that I appreciate about your writings, Don, is you take very technical topics. You take very technical details like the rate research, for example, or details in astronomy, and you bring them down to a level where your average person can understand. Because science, and I think I remember you saying this in an interview, something like science is for everybody, and science works to glorify God. And so why not reduce the technical information to a manner where we can all understand what's being said?
Well, that is the challenge, to bring things down to the bottom shelf where we can understand them. You have to be careful. You want to make it truthful. You have to say what's going on, but science does not have to be highly technical. If you become mathematical, you can go deeper with it, but it's for us. In fact, science is for us most of all, because we know who put it all together in the first place.
Looking at some of the comments and questions in the live chat brings this thought to mind. And we got a lot of positive feedback over this, Don. You're doing a great job. God would have created Adam and Eve not as babies, not as embryos. He would have created Adam enough to take care of the garden, fully formed trees. Leaves would have had chlorophyll. I assume Adam and Eve would have had pre-existing DNA differences. Rather than being created as clones, it makes sense that there would have been a mix of DNA differences. Therefore, when it comes to rocks, if scientists were to come about a year after creation and test some of these rocks using, let's say, uranium to lead, well, do you think God would have created those rocks with ratios, like a mix of uranium and lead atoms? Therefore, scientists would date those rocks and maybe get 1 billion plus years, even though those rocks were just newly formed.
All I would say is maybe he did.
Okay.
I like the idea of a world and a universe that was made fully formed in a mature level. As you mentioned, Adam and Eve, they came programmed with language and thought and the ability to, talk with their maker. And so there was a whole maturity to creation. Now, the extent of that, what was actually in those rocks, and the extent of the heavens, was starlight made thoroughly spread out? I think it was, by the way. I think that the first night, Adam and Eve could have looked up and seen the sky much as we see it today. Now, some would say, well, you're just explaining it away, that's the way God made it. And yes, that's what I am doing. I think that's the way it was, that creation was fully functional from the very start. And by the way, Donnie, this is what we're seeing even with this new James Webb telescope that you might have had with your your interviews.
Yeah.
We are looking to the fringes of the universe, and we are seeing fully functioning, beautiful spiral galaxies, the kind of thing that you cannot get out of the Big Bang. You're looking toward the start with those things, and they're there from the very beginning, a universe fully formed from the start.
Wow. Yeah, we did a program with Jason Lyle on that where he described the James Webb Space Telescope findings. Truly amazing. And so maybe this then, if Adam is created functionally mature, I like that. Functionally, he had to be. The Earth had to be created functionally mature. If scientists were to come about a day after Adam is created, maybe they'd find a mix. So if they were to look at his height and weight, they'd conclude he's older, maybe 20 to 30. But if they were to do some kind of blood tests where they're looking at cholesterol levels or other markers to determine health, they might conclude he's young. And so, or they were to look at his face, maybe there's no age spot, something like that, no wrinkles. And so perhaps you'd get a mix after creation, some evidence that points to him being older, some that points to him being younger. That's just the nature of him being created functionally mature. But it sounds like that's also what we find in the universe. We could look to C14 in diamonds and coal, for example, that point to the youth of the universe and the Earth. But then we might look to distant starlight or uranium to lead, let's say, and it looks a bit older. It seems like there's a mix, which could support what you're saying here, Don.
Well, yes, and thank you. Boy, to speculate on what Adam and Eve were like, where does that go? Did Adam have a navel? What kind of chemistry would you have? Of course, he was originally created with a possibility of living forever. That pre-flood world was a different world. And even after the fall, they lived for centuries. I think we are a mere shadow of what those people were like. I can't speculate on their early biology.
Well, it's a miracle that we could, after how many generations since Adam, we're a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. It's a miracle that we could even sit here and talk and have an intelligent conversation, because things were a lot different, like you said, in the pre-flood world. And so I'm really curious, in light of everything you're saying and we're discussing here, which I think is a lot of good information, the first rocks, if they would have had a certain ratios of atoms in them, so they start off with some uranium and lead, let's say, if that is the case, and I know we're just kind of speculating here, but if that is the case, is accelerated decay still necessary as a creationist? Is that something we should still invoke? Do you need both or just one or the other?
Well, of course, that Thousands Billions book discusses accelerated decay. That's an interesting view of things. I'm not totally convinced on that. I know it's in the book, and it's certainly a good option that we came up with. Here's what happens with that. During the Genesis flood, where our layers of sedimentary rock are being accumulated, between those layers, there's some volcanic activity. And that's the material that can be dated with radiometric dating. And that's the material where we find, let's say, 500 million years of decay. So this is something that's happening, it looks like, during the flood. And that's where we kind of pushed into this area of suggesting accelerated decay. I don't know if there might be some other explanation for it. Really, accelerated decay is not a simple explanation. That's quite a large-scale change in what we know about physics. But that we were led there mainly by material that formed during the flood.
Right. And that's, see, I understand the significance of your observations like helium and zircons, the radio halos, fission tracks, for example, interpreted as evidence for accelerated decay. My concern is always the heat, the excess amount of heat and radiation that would be produced from 1.5 billion years worth of decay in roughly a single year. Critics might say, well, that's going to cook the Earth. That's going to kill Noah and the animals. That's the effects of accelerated decay. A lot of critics say because of those effects means accelerated decay can't be true. And so I wonder if accelerated decay leaves us open to those kinds of criticisms. Do you think, Don?
Well, certainly, accelerated decay does lead to these other questions. What happens to all that heat? Enough heat to melt the whole Earth. So then you have to come up with another mechanism that God took the heat away. And our friend Gene Chaffin has done some work on that. But then you can go on. Well, if accelerated decay happened on the Earth, did it happen on Mars? Did it happen on the moon? Is there evidence there also? So you're kind of opening up quite a basket of questions when you suggest accelerated decay. It's a possibility. It may be a long shot. We're still working on it, but it is an alternative.
Right. Because once you start looking at the lunar rocks or rocks that are said to come from Mars, if they're dating 2 to 3 billion years, then one has to wonder, was accelerated decay solar system wise? And that's kind of an interesting question, isn't it? So yeah, no, I think it's good. I think it's also interesting to brainstorm these issues, Don. And so I appreciate you being willing to engage them in discussion. Okay, well, this has been a rigorous discussion, Don. I've really enjoyed it. We'll start winding down here. I really appreciate your time. What one of the audience members is curious as to your response to this, though. Before we wrap up, Wesley Coleman, he's wondering what your response to many of the critics who will say there is dysteleology, which is basically poor. So basically the critics will say, well, look at the bad design, and they'll point to certain examples, and therefore that's evidence against design.
Well, for many years it was said that there was poor design of the human eye. Well, we're taking a closer look at that and realizing that God had it right in the first place. Now, there are certainly problems in the animal and plant world. There are diseases. There are all kinds of things that can happen. That's all the result of a cursed world. But poor design, it is, I think improper for a person to say that when we don't have the whole story, when we have the whole picture. Poor design may just be kind of a surface view, but there's something beneath that. I would challenge poor design anywhere.
Very good. Apologetics 101. He's complimented you in your book, Thousands, Not Billions. He makes a contributing comment. He says, don't forget, there's also no EM field on the moon. It's directly exposed to radiation. So are meteorites. Any thoughts on that, Don? Because I know you have an invested interest in the moon.
Well, that's true. I'm mainly interested in the origin of the moon and all the theories that have gone by. But the moon is a different place. Yes, it is exposed to radiation. It would be a dangerous place unless you had protection, at least over a long period of time. And it is a place where meteorites collect. Yeah, the moon is our nearest neighbor in space. And we have been there. We'll probably return there one of these years. And yet the origin of the moon is a mystery. Fission doesn't work. Capture theory, nebula, collision. These theories roll on by one after another. If we haven't explained the origin of the moon, do we have any right to talk about the origin of the planets or the galaxies? We haven't really gotten to the first base. I think the moon is just a wonderful witness to creation, and it appears to be beyond explanation. And also, as we're finding, Donny, the moon does a number of things for us that we didn't realize before. It even controls our seasons.
Wow. What's the prevailing view among naturalists or evolutionists on the origin? Is it the ejection theory that the moon basically originated from Earth?
No, that's fission, and now that's been deleted. The theory right now is collision, that some object about the size of Mars smashed into the Earth, and then the material moved out into space and coalesced together and formed the moon, and then the Earth also formed, that they formed side by side. But our current models of this, something smacking into the Earth, should make two moons. We only have one. So again, the collision theory seems to be falling apart as well. And also, the moon's materials look just enough different that it wasn't a collision, and just enough alike that it doesn't look like it came from somewhere else. Again, these origin theories, there's a parade of them coming and going, and The moon is interesting. It's a witness to the creation.
A witness to the creation. I love the way you put it. So that idea, the result of a collision, is more based on evolutionary philosophy and less on evidence?
Well, it's just the latest view since nothing else worked. And I don't know what the next theory will be that's coming along, but I'm sure there will be one. It's just, these theories, each one lasts about a decade, and then a new idea is proposed. It may go back to the fission theory, who knows? But they come and they go.
They come and they go. So what would be the best explanation then for all the craters on the moon? Was the moon created with a personality with craters? Did they occur during creation week? Was it after the creation?
Well, the moon does have craters within craters. We've had 6,000 years of these things forming on the moon, so they've collected over time. It does look like there was a lot of debris in the early solar system. I don't know if that's connected with a flood. Sometimes the flood is extended too far into space, but there have been craters over time, some more, some less. It's often assumed, Donny, that everything in the moon is dead and there's been no new craters for a long period of time. But there are stories of people, cultures that saw some of these major craters form in historical time. So all of this stuff, once again, is not dated as old as people say. So it's been from the beginning till today that these craters have formed.
Very good. Okay, I think that's a good, helpful response. And there was one final interesting one here. Chat's moving quick. Hope I didn't lose it. No, here it is. Myths, Legends, 1463. To the audience, appreciate all the feedback and interaction on a great topic here tonight. Would the radio halos be able to be explained without accelerated decay?
Radio halos are defects in crystals formed by radiation. And the fact that we have those forming, that would be evidence for accelerated decay. I'm not sure how else you can get that over a short time span. There is a lot that we're learning about water that percolates through the ground, including through the areas where these halos are, and whether water could transport the material that could lead to those halos. That's a possibility. Again, you're into the interior of the earth where these things are forming, and the variables we're not always sure of. So accelerated decay is a straightforward idea, but whether water transport of materials might be involved might be another direction to go.
Okay, interesting point. So from my understanding, as you go down into the earth, and the drilling site, correct me if I'm wrong, is it Los Alamos drilling site where
the main one that the RATE project used, correct?
Okay, so the further you go down, are the radio halos, perhaps even fission tracks, are they obliterated at relatively low temperatures?
They're obliterated at high temperatures.
High temperatures, right?
Low temperature would lock them in. Whether that depends on the depth, I don't have an answer for you.
Okay. Well, I'm wondering, so because if they're obliterated at high temperatures, but they're here, and if they point to accelerated decay, well, then there must have been some kind of solution to the heat, I guess is what I'm getting at. Because if there's a heat problem, but yet we have radio halos.
You are back into the heat problem, which is a serious challenge to accelerated decay.
Well, this has been great, and I appreciate you engaging the audience as well, Don. You are a wealth of information, and I appreciate the organic back and forth discussion as well on quite a few topics. We've gone into the world of biology, genetics, astronomy, physics, geology, all in one show. So, Don, what I want to do is hand it to you for some final words, final thoughts, anything you want to leave myself with or the audience with as we wrap up our show tonight.
Well, listen, just appreciate the visit and covering, this whole vast area of nature. For me, this whole area, even though we don't have all the answers, it encourages Bible study and it encourages a study of nature. So it's a win-win, and the debate will go on all through this current age that we live in. I am encouraged to see this new generation of grad students and people that are interested in the topic, so they'll continue to push this. And we still got a lot to learn, even in this area of biomimicry, which is a fun area. And so I would challenge our listeners, come up with your idea. What do we find in nature that's a new product, a new invention, a new device? Nature is loaded with biometric secrets, and we're still finding them. Hey, thanks for listening.
Don, thank you for joining. I really appreciate all this information. We could win arguments all day, brother, but it's about winning souls. It's about the gospel. The gospel comes first. And I want to encourage people to check out your book, Dr. Don DeYoung, Our Created Moon, Earth's Fascinating Neighbor. You've done some tremendous work on the topic of origin. So I want people to support that. There's also your book here on astronomy in the Bible. And oh, that's your Created Moon one again. Thousands, not billions. You've done a lot of work, but your website, there we go. discoveryofdesign.com. So encourage people to check that out. I'll make sure these are linked in the description box of this video. Okay, Don, thank you very much for your time tonight. To the audience, thank you so much for tuning in. We appreciate the comments, the support, the feedback, and the interaction. I hope you all had as much fun as I did. God bless you. God bless you, Don. And Standing for Truth is signing out.
Thank you.